The following day, Lara had gone to her usual spot in the park to perform for a few hours. Open air concerts were a regular deal for her, bringing in enough extra income between her other appearances. She could relax when she played here. There was no need for the extra effort she'd put in at a fancy event. As she came to the end of her opening song, she put her lyre down for just a minute. A small crowd of ponies had gathered to watch her play. She nodded to them. Thanks for coming, every pony. Everybody. Really? Everybody. Don't forget the tips. Lara wondered if anybody would ask why about the way she was sitting. The regulars wouldn't. Sometimes a pony from out of town, not used to the sight of her, would stare at her slouching and perhaps ask what she was doing. Today nobody commented. It was how humans sat and pictures in her dreams. Lara had tried it herself and found it was comfortable. Her instrument case had been left open next to the bench, with a hastily written note pinned onto it. It was already filled up with coins. Today she hardly noticed it. She kept on going through the motions of playing, but her mind wandered to other topics. Doorknobs, for one thing. The round kind, not the long, straight ones. They were in just about every building in Equestria, but a pony couldn't grip it very well with hooves. Most of them were merely ornamental for that reason and didn't really latch the door closed. But a human, with fingers, they'd be able to use them. The same with the bowling alley Lara had walked past this morning to get here. She'd gone bowling with Bonbon a few times. All the balls had 3 holes on them. Why? They were about an inch in diameter or so, which, as Lara was pretty sure, meant that fingers could fit inside. An easy way for humans to hold them. As for ponies, there was no standard way to bowl. Unicorns used magic. Other ponies had a great creative bowling. Had to get creative. Bowling was a pretty old sport, wasn't it? Maybe she should look up the history. And she'd also noticed that the tools they'd been using last winter wrap-up. Shovels had handles on the ends which were easy enough for a pony to hold with their teeth, but then there's a long pole that made it unwieldy to use, unless the long pole was was supposed to be the handle. Lara watched a pony walk by with her filly. The mother dropped a few bits into the case. Lara nodded in a quick thanks and kept playing. And wasn't that the most interesting of all? Lara could practically see an invisible hand moving through the strings of her lyre. In fact, she hadn't even been aware of it, but that really was how she'd been playing ever since the first time she picked up the instrument, all those years ago. She had been told she was good at it. Maybe it was her technique, imitating the hands that had been designed for the instrument in the first place. Her mind kept working even as she went through the rest of her set. The sun was beginning to go down as she packed up her lyre and counted up how much money she'd made today. It was a good haul. With this month's performance, she'd be able to cover her share of the rent and then some. As she headed back home, Lyra just couldn't stop thinking about last night's dream. It could be her imagination, but everything that she saw seemed to fit together. The more she thought about humans, the more everything made sense. Why didn't anybody else see it? Lyra was in a big city somewhere. The tall buildings would have made her think it was Manhattan, except that she was surrounded by humans, all different kinds. Although they were less diverse than ponies, fewer colors, and only one race, there weren't any horns or wings to be seen. Still, the subtle variations in their facial features were enough to give them all a sense of individuality. She had dreams like this occasionally, except this time was different. Lyra looked down at herself. She stood on 2 legs. She was dressed just like one of the humans, with a green shirt and a light jacket over it, pants made out of some rough blue material, and hands. They were sticking out of her long sleeves. She lifted them up, moved her fingers, studying how the joints worked. So this was what it was like to be a human. Lara took a step forward, realizing she could easily keep her balance even on 2 legs, and started down the street. She wanted to see everything. The humans, the buildings, their entire city. Are you awake? She was now. She opened her eyes, noticing she was back in bed, with hooves like she had always had, and Bonbon was peeking in the doorway. Lyra, did you oversleep again? It's noon. Lyra groaned. It didn't matter what time it was. She wanted to go back to sleep. Her bed was feeling unusually comfortable today. I wouldn't have let you sleep in, but I've got an interview at Sugar Cube Corner soon. I'll probably be gone for a few hours. You've got the house to yourself. Lyra nodded slowly, but her thoughts were still on the sensation of being human and how real it had felt. Sure, she saw them often enough when she slept, but that was the first time she'd ever actually been one. She sighed, wishing she had had more time to see what exactly was going on in that city, how humans lived. She heard the front door swing closed, and Bonbon had just left. What now? Lyra's thoughts moved to her journal. Maybe she could record what little she had from the dream, or maybe go back to sleep and see if it would come back. No, that wasn't it. There was something else she could do. With a newfound sense of motivation, Lyra jumped out of bed and headed for the study. It had to be in one of her old books. The assignment had been very vague. A report on the history of Equestria, with the topic to be chosen by the student. Heartstrings had decided she didn't want to be just another pony writing about the Earth ponies, traditions of Winter Wrap-Up, or the contribution of Starswirl the Bearded to magical theory. Not even anything about famous musicians, like some of her friends had suggested. Sure, she had found she had a talent for the lyre, but she would rather play it than read about it. So, read about some old pony who had been famous for it. There are more interesting subjects out there, if she could find them. She'd gone to the Camelot Library to look up topics. Her dad was the head archivist here, so she knew her way around pretty well. Heartstrings found herself researching deeper into the depths of the Camelot Library. The building was already huge, and in the rooms back here the dust drifted in the air was enough to make her sneeze. No pony had been back here in years, it seemed, except maybe herself and her father. That only meant that no pony in her class was going to end up with the same research she did. Her eyes scanned the shelves, but she didn't really know what any of the titles in the section meant. She had chosen one of the old volumes at random and pulled it down with her magic, no longer a difficult task, and opened it to a random page in the middle. The illustrations weren't of anything she recognized, but they were still somehow appealing. Heartstrings couldn't explain why, but she was drawn to the way they walked upright, to the crude depictions of faces with small eyes and pointed noses to their hands. It said they were called humans. This book, written in old but still readable style, seemed to suggest that such creatures had actually lived. They had their own nations and rulers, civilizations like the ones that ponies lived in, but no mentions of ponies anywhere, not even of magic. She kept reading. Heartstrings had checked the shelves near where this book had come from, and there was a few more books that were also about humans. She'd read a few pages from one, but go back to another, come up with a question that might have an answer in one of the other books. Heartstring had spent all of that day in the library until she noticed the light streaming in from the dusty old window fading. Her mind was filled with questions. Why had she never heard of such wonderful creatures before? Where were there any left? Could she someday travel outside of Camelot and just and find kingdoms ruled and inhabited by humans? Heartstrings! She heard her dad's voice calling for her. He showed up around the corner, a dark blue unicorn with an unkempt mane and thick frame glasses. Ah, there you are. It's getting late. Time to head home. Yeah, sure. Can I take this with me? She held up the book. I don't think so. That one's for our older... Her dad's voice trailed off as he read the cover. Heartstrings? What were you reading that for? I'm going to write my history assignment about this. It's all about these creatures called humans, she said. She was practically bouncing with excitement. Have you ever heard of them before? Her father stared at the book for a while and finally said, Yes, Heartstrings. You do know that humans don't really exist, right? She felt like she'd been hit with a brick. What? Those old books, they're just myths. Stories that hardly any pony even remember anymore. Humans were made up a long time ago. But maybe you should just find another topic to read about. We've got a few books about Starswirl the Bearded. He was one of the finest unicorns to have ever lived. You know, he discovered hundreds of spells. Humans don't need spells. They do all sorts of things without magic, Heartstrings muttered. He frowned. I thought you liked using magic. Remember how excited you were? I know. She turned the book to the stack of books she'd piled it. Turned back to the stack of books she'd piled onto the table. It's not that I don't like magic. It's just that. Have you seen what humans did? All these inventions and cities and everything. They were amazing. Her father shook his head. It's all legend, folklore, nothing else. I'm surprised we even still have these old books around. I thought we were going to clean this wing out a long time ago. Why were you going to get rid of them? Heartstrings' eyes widened. You can't just throw them out. Those books can hardly be considered relevant anymore. Most ponies don't even talk about humans anymore. Can I keep them? That's not what I was saying. Please, why not? You were just going to throw them out anyway. Well, they're... Shaking his head, her father realized he couldn't argue with her. I suppose you can. Just promise me you won't take any of it too seriously. Heartstrings broke out into a wide grin. Thank you so much! She ran up to hug him. Now, we'd better head home before it gets too late, her dad said. We don't want your mother to worry. Heartstrings nodded and started loading the books into her saddlebags. She planned to read every one, front to back, no matter what her father seemed to think. These books weren't made up. The way they talked about humans was so consistent. They described something real, not just a collection of legends, and she was going to find out the truth. In the Ponyville library later that afternoon, Twilight had just been reviewing a new spell when she heard a knock at her door. She opened to find a familiar face. Hey, Twilight, mind if I borrow a book? Lyra asked. Hello, Lyra. Nice to see you. Twilight's attention went to Lyra's left front hoof. She was limping, and it was covered in thick, massive bandages. What happened? Are you all right? Oh, this... She lifted her hoof off the ground a few inches. I just had a little accident, that's all. It's no problem. If you don't mind, I could take a look at... No! Lyra drew her hoof back like it had been burned. I mean, that's not necessary. It's really not that big a deal. She gave a nervous laugh. She limped into the main room of the library, looking up at all the hundreds of old books. It was fairly tidy. She'd known the place to be like the aftermath of a hurricane, especially if Twilight was doing some intense research. Most of the time, really. So, what are you looking for? Twilight asked. Just wondering if you have any books about humans, Iris said, locating the H section. She started scanning the titles. The information in my personal collection wasn't exactly detailed enough. What are you looking for? I don't know if I... Lyra turned to stare at her. You've never heard of them, have you? She sighed. I'm not surprised. Sometimes I feel like nobody's ever heard of the humans before. Nobody? Twilight echoed. Ignoring her, Lyra continued searching. It might be under mythical creatures. That's where anything on them usually ends up. Not that I think they're mythical, of course. Based on the evidence, it's likely that human civilization invented printing, and they're the whole reason you have all these books. To be honest, according to what I've found... Twilight nodded a bit uneasily. She headed over to the section on myths. Not a corner of the library that she went to very often. There was never anything useful to her own studies there. I've got... Let's see. She pulled out a few books, scanning titles, covers as they flowed past her face. The Introduction to Mythical Creatures, Legendary Beasts, the illustration guide to Equestrian Cryptozoology. Did you say illustrated? Lara was next to her and fixated on a book before Twilight even knew what was happening. This would work perfectly. That's great, Twilight said. Lara was already flipping through the pages, frantically determined to find anything, to find something. She lifted her bandaged hoof and rubbed it against her other leg uncomfortably. As she went to open, went by one page, she stopped, flipped back to it, and her eyes widened. Perfect, she said. She stared at the drawing, almost pressing her face against it. May I ask what exactly you're studying? Twilight hesitantly looked over Lyra's shoulder, wondering if the other unicorn, even remembered she was there. Oh, right, it's this. She pointed to the drawing, which was some kind of claw or talon without the sharp points instead. Instead, the 5 appendages ended in soft, rounded tips. These are what humans' hands look like. This particular drawing is quite detailed. I've never seen anything like it. This is exactly what I need. And, Twilight paused. Why were you looking for this? Just curiosity, Lyra said, lifting up her bandaged left hoof. Hands are just so much more useful than hoofs. Think of how much life would change if we had fingers. She suddenly stopped, looked at her raised hoof in shock, and then quickly put it down. I suppose it does sound rather... Twilight tried to think of a word. Interesting? You bet. Anyway, I should really be getting back home before too late. Bonbon's interview should be over soon. I'll see you later, Twilight. Lara hobbled off to the front door as fast as she could on 3 legs. She stopped in front of the door and turned around. Right. You don't mind if I borrow this? No, that's absolutely fine. Twilight smiled nervously. Sometimes Lara could be a little strange. That was especially true today. Go right ahead. Thanks. I'll bring it back later. Any book that mentions humans is pretty rare, you know? And just like that, Lyra was out the door and headed back home. Twilight was left to wonder just what exactly she was up to and what these humans had to do with it.